She had traveled 1,100 miles wearing her dead sister's name, and the first thing the man at the platform said to her was, "You're not her." He didn't say it cruelly. That almost made it worse. Ethan Whitmore stood at the edge of the Raven Hollow station with his hat in both hands, and a look on his face that Eliza Hale would carry in her chest for the rest of her life. The precise expression of a man watching the last good thing he'd been promised dissolve right in front of him in public, in the dust, with half the town pretending not to watch from the far end of the platform. She had rehearsed this moment for 1,100 miles. She had a letter. She had an explanation. She had, she believed, a reason. None of it came out right. "My name is Eliza," she said. "Margaret was my sister." The word was did the rest. If a story like this one has ever made you ask yourself what you would do, stay or go, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now press like and let's begin. The train had been 2 hours late out of Colton Junction, which gave Ethan Whitmore 2 extra hours to stand on that platform and talk himself in and out of every version of the future he had imagined. He was not a man who imagined easily. That was the thing people in Raven Hollow didn't understand about him. They looked at the letters. Everyone in a town this small eventually knew about the letters. And they assumed a man who corresponded with a woman for 8 months must be a romantic, must be soft in some way that the frontier had not yet finished hammering out of him. They were wrong. Ethan Whitmore had not written those letters out of romance. He had written them out of something closer to arithmetic. He was 34 years old. His ranch, the Whitmore parcel, sat on 412 acres of land that had been his father's. And before that, a dream his father bought sight unseen from a land broker in St. Louis who had never set foot west of the Mississippi. The land was real. The dream it was supposed to contain had proven considerably more stubborn. The soil in the eastern quarter was alkaline and compacted. The well had been sunk in the wrong place by a man his father trusted. The cattle he'd inherited were thin-blooded and prone to illness, and the 2 ranch hands who'd known anything worth knowing had both drifted on to better-paying outfits 2 winters ago. He was not broke. Not yet. But he was close enough to broke that he could see it clearly when he looked at the account ledger. And what he saw was that a man running this operation alone, doing everything himself, making every decision in isolation without another mind to push against, was a man who would eventually make one mistake too many. He had written to Margaret Hale because he needed a partner. He had been honest about that in his very first letter, plainer than most men would have been, and he had half expected her to stop writing after she read it. She hadn't. She had written back and said she respected a man who told the truth about what he needed. 8 months of letters. He knew her handwriting better than he knew most people's faces. He knew she had grown up in western Pennsylvania, that her father had been a pharmacist, that she had managed his shop after he got sick and run it clean and profitable for 3 years before he died. He knew she could keep books and knew something about soil conditions from a summer she'd spent on her uncle's farm. He knew she wasn't afraid of hard work and had no illusions about frontier life. He had drawn a careful, useful picture of Margaret Hale in his mind over those 8 months, and it was not a romantic picture exactly. It was the picture of a competent, honest woman who might make something of the Whitmore parcel where he alone was failing. He had wanted her to arrive so he could see if the picture matched. The train was late, and then it was there, and then the passengers were coming down onto the platform, and Ethan stood at the edge of it with his hat in both hands because he didn't know what else to do with them, scanning faces, trying to match the description she had given him. Medium height, dark hair, gray coat. He found the gray coat. The woman wearing it was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not the expression he had expected. Not the cautious, assessing look of a woman meeting a stranger she had agreed to marry. This was something else. Something braced. Something that had already decided to absorb a blow. She was perhaps Margaret's height. Maybe a year or 2 younger. He couldn't tell. Dark hair like she'd described. The gray coat was travel-stained in a way that suggested a long journey made harder than it needed to be. He took 2 steps toward her and stopped. It was the eyes that told him. He didn't know how he knew. He just knew. "You're not her," he said. He hadn't meant to say it like that. It came out flat and certain because it was flat and certain, the way a man states a fact he has not yet decided how to feel about. The woman's chin moved slightly, a small, involuntary tightening. She held a letter in her hand. He noticed she was gripping it hard enough that the paper had begun to bend at the edges. "My name is Eliza," she said. "Margaret was my sister." The word was landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He stood there on that platform with his hat still in both hands, while the other passengers moved around them, and two women from the dry goods store watched from across the way, and the station master pretended to be very busy with a clipboard he hadn't looked at in 20 minutes. The afternoon light was doing that thing it did in October in Raven Hollow, cutting sideways and golden and making everything look more significant than it was. "When?" Ethan said. 6 weeks ago. Eliza's voice was steady. He would notice later how hard she must have been working to keep it that way. "She was sick for most of the summer. She didn't tell me how bad it was until it was already bad. And then at the end she made me promise to bring you this." She held out the letter. He didn't take it right away. He looked at it for a moment, at his own name written on the front in an unfamiliar hand. Not Margaret's careful, slanted script, but something tighter and more controlled. And he thought about how he had been standing on this platform for 2 hours constructing a future, and how it was possible to build something entirely in your mind and then have it simply not exist. He took the letter. He did not read it there. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket, and then he said, "Where are you going?" Eliza looked at him. I hadn't thought past this. I have enough money for a ticket back to Colton, and then east from there." "Is that what you want to do?" "I don't know what I want to do." She said it without apology. "I wanted to keep my promise to Margaret. I've done that. The rest of it I haven't worked out." Ethan put his hat back on. He looked down the platform at the two women from the dry goods store, who were, by this point, not even pretending to be doing anything other than watching. He looked at the train, which was already preparing to reverse and head back south. He looked at Eliza Hale, who was standing with everything she owned in 2 bags at her feet, in a town she had never seen, having just delivered the worst possible news to a man she had never met, and who was still somehow standing straight. "There's a hotel," he said. "Mrs. Alcott's boarding house on the main street. It's decent. You can stay there tonight and figure out what comes next. I can pay for it myself." "I know you can." He picked up the heavier of her 2 bags. "I didn't offer to pay for it." That was the first conversation. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes. It was also, Ethan would think later, one of the most honest conversations he had managed to have with another person in years. He read the letter that night at his kitchen table with the lamp turned up and a cup of coffee that went cold beside him. Margaret had written it in stages. He could tell by the changes in the handwriting. Some sections more controlled, some less. Some that looked like they had been written when she was in pain and pushing through it. She had not told him she was sick. She had known since the previous spring and had not told him. He sat with that for a long time before he continued reading. She had her reasons. He could see them between the lines, even where she didn't state them plainly. She had not wanted to become a burden. She had not wanted the correspondence to take on the weight of a dying woman's last hopes. She had wanted, for as long as she could manage it, for their letters to be what they had always been, 2 practical people thinking honestly together about a practical life. "I am telling you now," she had written, "because I cannot tell you after. I want you to know that the letters were real. Every word I wrote was true. I was not performing for you, and I was not looking for someone to pity me. I was looking for exactly what I said I was looking for, and I found it, and I am sorry that I can't be what I said I would be." He stopped reading for a while at that paragraph. "My sister Eliza is the one bringing you this," the letter continued. "I asked her to, and she didn't want to, and I asked again and she didn't say no. That's how Eliza is. She doesn't say yes easily, and she doesn't say no when it matters. She's more stubborn than me, which you would not believe if you'd known me. She's had a harder time of things than I have, and she doesn't talk about it, which I think you will understand better than most. I'm not asking you to replace what we might have had. I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel or offer something you don't have. I'm only asking you to be decent to her because she deserves decency and hasn't always gotten it, and because I think you are, underneath your various difficulties, a decent man. I thought about our ranch. I thought you should know that." That last line was the one that undid him. Not the grief exactly, though the grief was there, solid and unexpected, for a woman he had never met but had somehow known. It was the specificity of it. Our ranch. She had thought of it that way. She had imagined herself into a life that had never gotten to happen, and she had done it honestly, and he had not known any of it was ending while it was happening. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the tin box where he kept the other letters. All of them, everyone Margaret had sent since the beginning. He did not sleep much that night. In the morning, he went to Mrs. Alcott's boarding house. Eliza was in the small front parlor that Mrs. Alcott used as a waiting area, sitting in one of the stiff wooden chairs with her hands in her lap, looking like a woman who had already been awake for hours. She had changed into a different dress, dark blue, less formal than the traveling clothes, and she looked slightly less braced than she had at the station. Slightly. "I read the letter," Ethan said. "I know." He sat down in the chair across from her. Mrs. Alcott had the good sense to disappear into the back of the house. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it straight." "All right." "The letters after Margaret died. You wrote them." Eliza looked at him steadily. "Yes." "How long?" "The last 3. She died on a Wednesday. There was a letter from you that arrived the following Monday." She had started a reply and couldn't finish it. I finished it. I told myself I was going to write one letter and tell you she was ill and that there might be a delay. And then I wrote the next one and told myself the same thing." She paused. "And then I was on a train." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "Because she asked me to," she said finally. "Not the letters specifically. She asked me to bring you the letter she'd written and to look you in the face when I gave it to you, so you'd know it was real and not something slid under a door. And I think, when I was writing those last 3 letters, I kept thinking about what she would have said. And it was easier to hear her voice in my head than to think about the fact that she was gone." The parlor was very quiet. "That's not a good reason," Eliza added. "I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm not in the business of forgiving things I'm not sure need forgiving," Ethan said. She looked at him differently then. Not warmer exactly, but differently. "What did you mean to do?" he said. "When you got here, past giving me the letter." "I thought I'd take the next train south and go on from there. I don't have anything in Pennsylvania to go back to. I was thinking I might find work in one of the larger towns. I can keep books. I managed my father's shop for several years." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "I have skills. I can land somewhere." "What kind of farming did you do at your uncle's place?" She looked at him. "What?" "Margaret mentioned it in one of her letters. She said you'd spent a summer on your uncle's farm." Something shifted in Eliza's expression. A small, careful recalibration. 3 summers, actually. He had 60 acres in Ohio. Mostly corn and kitchen vegetables, but he ran a 1/4-acre kitchen garden for the local market that I helped manage from the 2nd summer on. And I did 2 seasons of experimental planting with him, different soil amendments, trying to improve the yield on some clay-heavy ground he had in the north field. She stopped. "Margaret talked about farming?" "She mentioned it once. I may have pressed her on it. Soil conditions were relevant to what I was describing about the east quarter of my parcel." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "She was always better at talking to people than I was. She would have found a way to tell you that herself." Ethan looked at the window, then back at her. "I have a proposition," he said. "You don't have to take it." She waited. "My ranch is struggling. That's not a secret. I've been running it at a loss in the east quarter for 2 seasons, and I've been covering it with the grazing income from the west. But that can't go on indefinitely. Margaret knew about it. We had talked about some approaches." He stopped. "What you just described about your uncle's north field, the clay soil, the amendments, that's close to what I'm dealing with." Eliza was very still. "I'm not asking you to stay permanently," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything that Margaret was going to be. I'm asking for 1 week. You stay at the ranch, not at a hotel I'm not paying for anyway, and you look at the east quarter and tell me what you think. Honest assessment. If it's nothing, you've lost a week and you go south and find work. If there's something in it, we figure out the next step then." "And what do I get?" Eliza said. "Room and board for the week, fair wage for any real work you do, and a reference, if you want one, for whatever you go to next." "I'd be earning my place," she said, "not staying not out of charity." "I said as much." She looked at him for a long moment. He had the sense she was running calculations of some kind, not financial ones, but the harder kind. The calculations people make when they are trying to figure out whether a situation is what it appears to be or something else. 1 week, she said. 1 week? She nodded once. All right, what? He drove her out to the ranch that afternoon in the wagon, and she didn't say much on the ride, and neither did he, which he found he didn't mind. Margaret had been a talker. He'd known that from the letters. Warm and expansive and prone to asking follow-up questions about things he'd mentioned only in passing. Eliza sat beside him and looked at the land and said nothing, and he understood after a while that she was not being cold. She was reading. She was looking at the scrub and the soil color and the way the water cut the lower ground, and she was doing what he had asked her to come out here to do. The east quarters behind that ridge, he said. I can see where it would be from the drainage pattern, she said. He glanced at her. She was right. The ranch house was not much to look at. He knew that. He'd lived in it for 7 years and made various practical improvements, but it was still a working man's structure, solid, functional, and cheerless in the way of things built entirely without consideration for how they looked. He watched Eliza take it in when they pulled up, and she said nothing, which he appreciated more than any comment she might have made. His ranch hand, a quiet man of about 50 named Dale, who had been with him for 3 years and asked no unnecessary questions, came out to help with the wagon. He looked at Eliza and then at Ethan and then back at Eliza and said, "Ma'am," and took the horse's head without further inquiry, which was exactly why Ethan had kept him on when he'd let the others go. The house had a second room that had functioned as storage. Ethan had cleared it out in the weeks before Margaret was due to arrive and put a bed in it, a proper bed, one of the purchases he'd made in anticipation. He showed Eliza to it and said the arrangements were simple, and she said they were fine, and that was that. That first evening, she asked to walk the east quarter before dark. He went with her. He showed her the soil compaction problem, the alkaline patches he'd been trying to work around, the failed drainage trench his father had put in that ran the wrong direction and made everything worse every wet season. She crouched in several places and picked up handfuls of soil and broke them apart with her fingers and smelled them the way his uncle used to smell soil, the way people who really knew soil did, without any self-consciousness about it. How deep is your topsoil before you hit the hard pan? She asked. 8 to 10 inches in the good sections, 4 to 6 in the problem areas. And the alkaline patches. Have you tested the pH, or are you going by what you're seeing? What I'm seeing, I've got litmus paper back at the house if you want to run tests. She stood up and looked across the quarter. The light was going gold and flat, and she stood in it with her hands at her sides and soil on her fingers, and she looked nothing like what he had imagined any of this would look like. The drainage trench needs to be redirected, she said. That's the first thing. Everything else is downstream of that problem. Once the water's moving right, you'll recover some of the alkaline patches naturally. The rest, there are amendments, but they take time and they need to be done right or you waste the season. Can you do it? She turned to look at him. In a week? In whatever time it takes, he said. I'm asking if you know how. She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said. I know how. Word got around Raven Hollow. The way word always got around a town of 400 people, which was to say within approximately 48 hours, everyone who was going to have an opinion about Ethan Whitmore's mail-order bride situation had formed one. Most of those opinions were delivered to other people rather than to Ethan directly, which was the usual arrangement in a town like this. The version that circulated first was simple. The bride died, the sister came instead, and Ethan had let her stay at the ranch, which was either pitiable or suspicious, depending on who you asked. The version that circulated in the Cross household was neither pitiable nor suspicious. It was simply another data point in a portrait that Vivian Cross had been composing for years about the Whitmore situation and what it meant about Ethan's character and prospects. Vivian Cross was 26 years old and had grown up understanding, with perfect clarity, exactly what her family's position in Raven Hollow was worth and exactly what it would take to maintain it. Her father, Harlan Cross, owned the largest working ranch in the county, had a hand in the mine operations 3 miles north of town, and was the kind of man whose opinion the town council consulted before making any decision that might affect commerce. Vivian had grown up in that shadow and learned to operate in it with considerable skill. She had known Ethan Whitmore since they were children. She had watched him work his failing inheritance for 7 years with something that was not quite respect, but was close to it. He was stubborn and competent. She would give him that. She had also, at various points, made it clear to people who asked that she did not consider the Whitmore parcel a viable operation, which was true, and that she did not consider Ethan a suitable match by any measure that mattered, which was also, she believed, true. What she had not anticipated was that some woman from Pennsylvania arriving by mistake would make her feel, for the first time in years, like she was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She heard about Eliza at the dry goods store on the day after the train arrived. She went home and thought about it for 2 days. Then she put on her good riding clothes and rode over to the Whitmore parcel on the pretext of informing Ethan that her father's cattle had pushed through the fence line on the northeast corner, and she wanted to sort out the repair before the week was out. Eliza was in the east quarter when Vivian arrived. Eliza was on her knees in the dirt next to the misdirected drainage trench, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a notebook open beside her that appeared to contain a diagram of some kind. She looked up when she heard the horse. Vivian looked down at her from the saddle. There was a long pause. "You must be the sister," Vivian said. Eliza said, "And you must be someone with an opinion about that." Vivian Cross had not, in recent memory, had someone answer her that way. She sat with it for a moment, one hand resting on the saddle horn, and looked at this woman in the dirt of Ethan Whitmore's east quarter, and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. "Where's Ethan?" she said. "He rode out to the north fence line. He'll be back before midday." Eliza had gone back to her notebook. "I can tell him you came by." "I'll wait." "Suit yourself." Vivian did not wait. She sat on the horse for another few minutes while Eliza made notations in her diagram and didn't look up again. And then she turned the horse and rode back toward the Cross property and felt, for reasons she could not immediately account for, that something about the visit had not gone the way she had intended. She would not forget the woman in the dirt. She would spend the rest of that week making sure she didn't have to. That evening, after Dale had gone to the bunkhouse and the supper dishes were cleared, Ethan asked Eliza what she'd written in the notebook. She spread it open on the kitchen table between them. The diagram was more detailed than he'd expected. She'd mapped the entire drainage pattern of the east quarter from memory, indicating the redirection the trench would need and 3 possible paths for it based on the natural grade of the land. Beside the diagram were soil notes, pH estimates, calculations for amendment quantities, and their cost against projected improvement timelines. He read through it carefully. "This is 2 seasons' work," he said. "The drainage trench is 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the ground is difficult. The amendment program is 2 seasons, yes. You won't see the full improvement until the 3rd growing year. But the income from the kitchen garden can start the 1st season, if you commit the space to it." She pointed to a section of the diagram. "This corner has the best existing topsoil and the most favorable drainage once the trench is right. That's where I'd start. 12 varieties. Market directed. Not what you feel like growing, what the town can actually use and will pay for. Mrs. Alcott mentioned to me this morning that she sources vegetables from 40 miles south because there's nothing close. That's a market." Ethan was quiet. "You talked to Mrs. Alcott about this," he said. "She talked to me. I listened." Eliza folded the corner of a page. "People in this town will tell you everything about what they need if you give them half a chance. Most of them just want someone to ask." He looked at her across the table. She was looking at the diagram, not at him, her finger tracing the line of the proposed drainage reroute with the focus of someone who had already moved past the planning stage and was thinking about execution. She was nothing like what he had imagined. He wasn't sure yet if that was the problem or something else entirely. "1 week," he said. She looked up. "We said 1 week," he said. "That's almost up. The drainage work alone is more than a week." She held his gaze. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. He looked at the diagram, at the soil notes, at the market calculation in the corner of the page that she had done in a clean, precise hand while he was riding the north fence line, and she was on her knees in his east quarter reading his land like it was something worth reading. "I'm asking if you want to," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub the way it always did in October, dry and purposeful, with no sentiment about it at all. "I want to fix the drainage trench," Eliza said finally. "After that, I don't know." It wasn't yes. It wasn't no either. Ethan Whitmore, who had not been given to hope in a long time, found that he could live with that. The drainage trench took 11 days. Ethan had estimated 2 weeks and Eliza had said 2 to 3, and they finished it in 11 days, which meant that neither of them had accounted for what happened when two people who were both stubborn about doing things right worked the same problem from opposite ends and refused to let the other one carry more than their share. Dale watched this process with the expression of a man who had seen stranger things but was not sure when. The work was not romantic. It was not the kind of thing that got easier as it went. The ground in the East Quarter was harder than Eliza's probe testing had suggested. There was a layer of compacted subsoil about 14 inches down that her uncle's Ohio clay had not prepared her for, and on the third day she hit it in 3 consecutive test digs and stood up with her shoulders aching and reassessed every timeline she had calculated and did not say anything about it until she had reworked the numbers in her notebook that evening. "It's going to be longer," she told Ethan at supper. "I figured." "You figured." "The ground in this county does that. There's a hard pan layer. My father didn't know about it either when he dug the original trench, which is part of why it went wrong." Eliza set down her fork. "You could have told me that before I started." "I could have," he agreed, "but you didn't ask, and I wanted to see how you handled it when you found out." She looked at him across the table for a long moment. "That's a strange way to assess someone," she said. "It works." "And what's your assessment?" He picked up his coffee. "You recalculated the whole thing in one evening and came to me straight with the new numbers. Most people would have either hidden it or panicked." He drank. "So, assessment's fine." Eliza said nothing for a moment. Then she went back to her supper. "I'm staying through the drainage work," she said. Not a question, not quite a statement either. "I know," Ethan said. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north and was pushing dust against the window glass. And neither of them said anything more about it that night, which was, Eliza was beginning to understand, how Ethan Whitmore handled most things that mattered, by acknowledging them once, plainly, and then going back to work. The 1-week arrangement had dissolved so quietly that there was no specific moment either of them could have pointed to as the moment it ended. What replaced it was less defined and more practical. Eliza was doing work that needed doing. She was doing it competently, and the ranch required it. The wage Ethan had offered for the first week continued without either of them formalizing it. Mrs. Alcott's boarding house became a memory. What did not dissolve was the town's interest in the situation. Raven Hollow was not a cruel town, exactly. It was the kind of small, isolated community that had developed a certain intimacy with its own business because there wasn't much else to be intimate with. People knew each other's difficulties the way they knew the weather. Not because they were nosy, though some were, but because in a town of 400 the walls were thin and the distances short, and information moved the way water moved, finding every available channel. The information that moved most efficiently. That November was about Ethan Whitmore and the woman staying at his ranch, and it moved in 2 distinct currents depending on who was carrying it. The first current was costly, sympathetic. Maren Schultz, who ran the feed store with her husband and had known Ethan since he was a boy, told people that she thought the whole situation was deeply sad, but that Ethan seemed to be managing it with dignity, and that the Hale woman had come in twice to the feed store for supplies and had known exactly what she wanted and paid without negotiating, which Maren considered a reliable indicator of character. The second current originated in the Cross household. Vivian Cross had not forgotten the woman in the dirt. She had thought about her, in fact, with the sustained attention of someone who has identified a problem and is taking the measure of it before deciding what to do. What bothered Vivian was not anything she could have stated plainly without sounding petty. It was not that Eliza Hale was beautiful. She wasn't, not in any way that Vivian would have called remarkable. It was not that Eliza had taken something from her because Vivian had never seriously considered Ethan Whitmore a candidate for anything she actually wanted. It was something subtler and more irritating than either of those things. It was that Eliza Hale had arrived with nothing, no invitation, no family here, no money beyond what she'd described as enough for a return train ticket, and within 2 weeks had apparently made herself essential to the operation of the Whitmore Ranch in a way that Vivian, with all her family's resources and her own considerable intelligence, had never been essential to anything she hadn't already owned. She raised the subject with her father one evening in November when they were going over the quarterly account books. "Whitmore's got that woman doing labor out on his east quarter," she said. "Apparently she's redirecting the drainage." Harlan Cross looked up from the ledger. He was a broad, deliberate man who had built his holdings through patience and a specific kind of ruthlessness that he considered simply good business. What do you know about the East Quarter drainage? Enough to know it's been his main production problem for years. If she fixes it, that land becomes viable. Let him have it, Harlan said, and went back to the ledger. Whitmore's 400 acres aren't competition. They're not now. Harlan looked at her again, and this time there was something measuring in it. What exactly are you concerned about? Vivian looked at the window. Outside, the last of November's light was going gray and thin. I'm not concerned, she said. I'm paying attention. Her father studied her for a moment. Then he made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been dismissal and went back to the numbers. Vivian went back to paying attention. The drainage trench was finished on a Wednesday, 11 days in, and Eliza stood at the top of the redirected channel that evening and watched the water run the way it was supposed to run, downhill, away from the problem areas, following the natural grade of the land instead of fighting it, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not pride exactly. Or not only pride, something more complicated than that. She had not thought past the trench. She had said as much to Ethan, and it had been true when she said it, but standing here watching water move correctly through ground that had been working against itself for years, she found that the honest answer to what she felt was that she didn't want to stop. That was an uncomfortable realization. She had a clear mental image of herself as someone passing through, a woman doing a practical thing for practical reasons, temporarily, in a place that was not hers, for a man who was not anything she had assigned a category to yet. The image had been useful. It had made it easier to work without the weight of what the work might mean. The water ran correctly down the channel. She heard Ethan come up behind her. He stood beside her and looked at it. That's it, he said. That's it. They stood there for a moment. The amendment program starts next week if you're going to catch the right soil temperature window, Eliza said. After that, the kitchen garden layout. I've been revising the 12 variety plan. I think we can do 14 if we stage the planting right. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Eliza. She looked at him. I'm not going to keep pretending this is still the original arrangement, he said. You've been here 3 weeks. You've done more to that East Quarter in 3 weeks than I've managed in 2 years. I want you to stay. As what? She said. He met her gaze. As a partner in this operation. Formal arrangement, fair split of any profits from what you build. Your name on the labor agreements for any workers we hire for the garden. Not as a favor, not as a consolation for what happened with Margaret, as someone who's earned a place here. The last light was going off the land. Somewhere in the scrub, a nightbird was beginning its noise. I don't want to be a charity case, Eliza said. I know. And I don't want to be a replacement. I know that too. She looked back at the trench, at the water doing what it should. All right, she said. It was the second time she'd said those words to him on what felt like an impossible question, and it felt different this time, heavier and more considered and more real. Ethan nodded once. All right. The amendment program began on a Monday, and it was harder than the drainage work in a different way. The drainage work had been physical and finite, with a clear endpoint you could stand and look at. The amendments were slow and incremental, and required a kind of patience that was harder to sustain because the results were invisible for weeks. Eliza had sourced the materials through the feed store, working through Maren Schultz, who turned out to be more knowledgeable about local soil chemistry than Eliza had expected, and who had opinions about the specific limestone supplier Eliza was considering that were both strong and correct. They spent 40 minutes in the feed store one morning, going back and forth about application rates, and Maren's husband came in twice to see if Maren was needed for something, and retreated both times without interrupting. She knows what she's doing, Maren told her husband that evening. Not book knowing, real knowing, the kind you get from doing it wrong a few times first. This assessment made its way through the sympathetic current in Raven Hollow's information network, and reached, among others, Lou Parrish, who ran the small produce operation on the South Road, and had been increasingly frustrated by the difficulty of getting fresh vegetables in at a reasonable price from the South suppliers. Lou rode out to the Whitmore ranch that week, not quite on business and not quite on curiosity, and landed somewhere in the middle, talking to Eliza in the East Quarter for over an hour about the kitchen garden plan, and leaving with what felt like the beginning of an arrangement about bulk purchasing once the first season was in. Ethan watched this happen from the fence line and said nothing about it. What he was noticing, and not saying, was that Eliza had a way with people that was completely unlike what he'd expected from the quiet, controlled woman who had sat across from him in Mrs. Alcott's parlor and answered his questions with no excess. She was still quiet. She still didn't spend words she didn't need to spend. But when she was in the middle of something, she understood the soil, the garden plan, the specific problem someone was trying to solve. She opened up in a way that was different from her general manner, and people responded to it. Lou Parrish was not the last one to ride out to the East Quarter that month. The trouble began in the second week of December, and it began, as Ethan might have predicted if he'd been paying the right kind of attention, in the direction of the Cross property. He was in town picking up a hardware order when Vivian found him. She appeared at his elbow in front of the hardware store with the precision of someone who had timed the encounter, which she had. She was wearing her good coat, and her hair was done in the particular way she wore it when she meant to be noticed, and she smiled at him in the way she had always smiled at him, with warmth that was also somehow withholding, that offered something while simultaneously clarifying the terms. "Ethan," she said, "I heard the drainage work is finished." "It is." "That must be a relief." He looked at her directly. "What do you want, Vivian?" The smile didn't exactly falter. It adjusted. "I wanted to say that I hope things are going well out there. Given everything. Things are going fine." "I'm glad." She paused. "I heard she's planning some kind of market garden." "She is." "That's ambitious." Another pause, more deliberate this time. "I just want to make sure you've thought through Ethan, she's a stranger. She arrived here under strange circumstances. People in town are talking. People in town always talk. They're saying she came here under false pretenses, that the letters she wrote were a kind of deception." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what they're saying?" he said. "Some people. I'm not saying I agree." The smile again. "I just think you should know what's out there, because I care about what happens to you. You know I always have." Ethan picked up his hardware order from the counter, settled with the storekeeper, and turned back to Vivian. "Margaret asked her sister to bring me a letter," he said. "She did that. She also wrote 3 letters that helped me get through a rough stretch before I knew Margaret was gone. I don't call that deception. I call that someone doing what needed doing under circumstances that were hard." He settled the package under his arm. "As for what people are saying, people can say what they want. They usually do." He left. Vivian watched him go with the expression of someone filing information away for later. Ethan didn't tell Eliza about the conversation right away. He went back to the ranch and worked through the rest of the day and ate supper and sat with it for a while, trying to figure out what there was to tell that was useful versus what was simply the kind of ambient noise that surrounded any situation that deviated from what a small town considered normal. He told her the following morning. They were in the East Quarter, and she was marking out the kitchen garden plot with string and stakes, and he relayed the conversation as accurately as he could without editorializing. Eliza listened. She kept pulling the string taut between 2 stakes while she listened. When he finished, she said, "She's going to be a problem." "Probably." "Not because she's dangerous," Eliza said. "Because she's smart, and she has standing in this town, and she's decided to care about this." She drove a stake into the marked corner of the plot. "She came out here 2 weeks ago. Did I tell you that?" "No." "She rode up while you were on the north fence and looked at me from the horse and called me the sister and waited for me to be bothered by it." Eliza moved to the next corner. "I wasn't." "Are you bothered by it now?" She thought about it for a moment, honestly, the way she thought about most things. "I'm bothered by the idea that the garden plan suffers because of gossip. The work is what it is. If it succeeds, people will see that it succeeds. If Vivian Cross is telling people I came here under false pretenses, the only answer to that is results." Ethan watched her stake the third corner of the plot. "You're not worried about what people think of you," he said. "I'm worried about what they think of the operation," she said. "My reputation is attached to the operation. So in that sense, yes. But not because I care what Vivian Cross thinks of me personally." She paused. "She's never had to earn anything she has. That makes her particular kind of contempt a lot easier to carry." He nodded slowly. "There's one more thing," he said. "She mentioned the letters." Eliza stilled for just a moment. Just a fraction. "Who else has she told that to?" she said. "I don't know. She framed it carefully. She didn't say you'd done wrong. She just Raise the question. That's how she operates. That's how people operate when they want to plant something without being seen doing it. Eliza set the last stake and straightened up. She looked at the marked plot, now a clean rectangle in the east quarter soil, and then she looked at Ethan. "What do you want to do about it?" "Nothing," he said. "Same thing you said. Results." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said, for what felt like the 100th time since she'd arrived, and she bent down and picked up the next length of string. What Vivian Cross had planted in the social soil of Raven Hollow was small, at first, but she tended it carefully. The word she used, consistently and with the measured precision of someone who has learned how to shape opinion without appearing to be doing so, was questionable. She didn't say Eliza Hale was dishonest. She didn't say Ethan was being deceived. She simply introduced, in the right conversations, the framing that the situation was questionable, that the circumstances of Eliza's arrival raised questions worth considering, that a reasonable person might wonder whether a woman who had carried on a correspondence under false pretenses was entirely to be trusted in other matters. She said this to her father's business associates. She said it to the wives of the mine supervisors at a December gathering at the Cross House. She said it, most effectively, to Harriet Drummond, who was 63 years old and had lived in Raven Hollow her entire life, and knew everyone, and was not cruel, but was deeply committed to what she considered the proper order of things. Harriet carried it further than Vivian had perhaps intended. By mid-December, there was a section of Raven Hollow that had concluded, without knowing precisely how they'd come to conclude it, that the woman at the Whitmore ranch had arrived under suspicious circumstances, and that Ethan, who was a decent man but not always a discerning one, might be being taken advantage of. Eliza heard it in the feed store. She didn't hear it directly. Nobody said it to her face, because Raven Hollow was not that kind of town. She heard it in the half-second pause before Marin's assistant, a young woman named Carol, responded to a question about limestone delivery. She heard it in the way two women in the dry goods store stopped talking when she came in and then resumed too brightly. She heard it in the particular quality of the silence that surrounded her in certain spaces, the kind of silence that is not neutral. She went home and made supper and didn't say anything about it. She went over her notebook that evening and refined the kitchen garden projection and calculated 3 possible yield scenarios for the first season and wrote down what she'd need to purchase, when, and from whom. The next morning, she went back to work. What changed the temperature in Raven Hollow's divided opinion happened unexpectedly, the way most things that matter happen, not through a dramatic confrontation or a formal vindication, but through something small and unglamorous and very hard to argue with. It was late December and the ground was frozen too solid for outdoor work, and Eliza had turned the kitchen garden preparation to winter tasks, ordering seeds, building the cold frames she would need for early starting, calculating the amendment schedule for when the ground thawed. She was at Mrs. Alcott's boarding house one afternoon picking up a package of seed catalogs she'd had forwarded there, and she found Mrs. Alcott in the kitchen in a state of quiet distress over the boarding house's account books, which were not, Mrs. Alcott confided, in a good way. Eliza sat down at the kitchen table. She spent 2 hours with those account books. Not because she had been asked to, exactly. Mrs. Alcott had not asked, had only been distressed in the general direction of someone she trusted, but because Eliza had looked at a set of numbers in trouble and could not make herself leave them that way. She found 3 errors that were not Mrs. Alcott's fault, overcharges from a supply vendor that had been accumulating for over a year, and 1 category of expense that could be restructured to save money without affecting operations. She wrote out a clean summary and left it on the table with a note explaining each item. Mrs. Alcott told Marin Schultz about it the following morning. Marin Schultz told Lou Parrish. Lou Parrish told his wife, and his wife told 3 other women, and 2 of those women recalibrated their opinion of Eliza Hale. Not because the story was dramatic, but because it was the kind of story that was very hard to square with the word questionable. Harriet Drummond heard it secondhand and sat with it for 2 days, and then, on a cold Thursday morning in the last week of December, walked into the feed store while Eliza was there picking up a small parts order, and introduced herself directly, and asked Eliza a specific and technical question about kitchen garden layouts in alkaline soil. Eliza answered it. They talked for 20 minutes. Harriet asked 3 follow-up questions, each sharper than the last, and Eliza answered each one without condescension and without simplifying, and at the end of it Harriet Drummond nodded once and said, "You know what you're doing," in a tone that made it clear this was both an assessment and a verdict, and went home and made certain adjustments to her own view of the situation that she shared with several people over the following week. The current in Raven Hollow shifted. Not all of it. Vivian Cross was not the kind of person whose campaign dissolved overnight, and what she had planted had roots. But something in the balance of the town's opinion moved, slightly and meaningfully, in a different direction. What Ethan noticed in January was that Eliza had started to have conversations. Not just the practical transactions at the feed store or the supply discussions with Lou Parrish. Actual conversations with the people of Raven Hollow, extended and real, of the kind that happened when a person was no longer being treated as a visitor. He saw it first when Frank Milligan, who had a small operation 2 miles east and had been struggling with the same alkaline soil problem on a smaller scale, rode over one Saturday morning and spent 2 hours with Eliza in the kitchen going over the amendment schedule she'd developed. Milligan left with notes in his hand and a slightly dazed expression that Ethan recognized as the specific look of a man who has just been given more useful information than he expected. He saw it again when 3 families from the south side of town came through on the same day in different errands. All of them, it turned out, either connected to the mine operation or connected to families that were, and all of them found reasons to stop and talk to Eliza, who had by this point acquired the particular standing in a small community that comes not from being liked, but from being genuinely useful. "You're building something," Ethan said one evening. Eliza looked up from the seed catalog. "The garden." "Not just the garden." She held his gaze. "I'm just talking to people." "That's what I mean." She looked at the catalog again, and he thought for a moment she was going to let it go, but she said, "Margaret would have been better at this. She would have made everyone feel like she'd always been here." A pause. "I'm still a stranger to most of them. I'm aware of that." "You're less of a stranger than you were." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed, "but it's something." She turned a page in the catalog. The lamp made a soft noise in the draft from the window. "I got a letter," she said, "from back east, from a woman I used to know in Pennsylvania. She heard I was out here and wanted to know how I was getting on." She paused. "I didn't know how to answer her. I've been thinking about what I'd say." "What would you say?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. "That I'm still figuring it out," she said, "but that I think the land here is something. I think it can be something." Another pause, smaller. "I think I might be staying." Outside the window, the January wind moved through the scrub the way it had in October, dry and without sentiment, and Ethan Whitmore sat across the table from the woman who had arrived carrying someone else's name in someone else's place and found that the thing he felt about that was not complicated at all, underneath all the ways it was complicated. "Good," he said, and went back to his own work and didn't say more than that, because it was enough, and because some things didn't need more words than they needed. The first seeds went into the cold frames on a Saturday in late February, 6 weeks before the ground would be ready for direct planting. And Eliza worked that morning with the particular focus of someone who has been waiting a long time for a thing to begin. She had built the cold frames herself, with Dale's help, and over Dale's quiet objections. He had wanted to build them larger. She had explained why smaller was better for temperature management in this climate. And they had disagreed about it for 3 days in the way people disagree when they both know enough to have a real argument. The frames were her dimensions in the end. Dale had helped build them to her specifications without further comment, which was his way of conceding a point. Ethan watched her set the first trays that morning from the fence line. He had learned, over the months since October, when to be present and when to stay out of the way, and this was a staying out of the way moment. Not because Eliza had said so, but because he had come to read the quality of her concentration the way he read weather, and what he saw in her now was something that didn't need an audience. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. When she was done, she stood outside the frames and looked at them for a long moment, and he saw something pass across her face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but somewhere between the two. The expression of someone who has committed to something and can no longer pretend they haven't. He brought her coffee. She took it without looking at him. 6 weeks, she said. Then what? Then we find out if the cold frame temperatures held correctly over winter, and if my seed sourcing was right, and if the soil amendment has done what I think it's done in the East Quarter. She drank the coffee. A lot of things I'm not certain about. You seem certain enough in January. I was confident enough in January. That's different. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. Confident means you've done the calculation and it adds up. Certain means you know. I never know until it's in the ground. Ethan nodded. He understood that distinction. It was the same one he applied to cattle and weather and most of the decisions that determined whether a year ended in the black or the red. "What do you need from me today?" he said. "Nothing today. Go fix the section of fence Dale's been worrying about on the west line." She handed the cup back to him. "I'll tell you when I need you." He went and fixed the fence. March came in cold and then turned, the way March did in this part of the country. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the season had been waiting just over a ridge and finally got tired of waiting. The ground in the east quarter softened faster than Eliza had calculated, which meant she was scrambling to prepare the beds ahead of schedule, which meant the first 2 weeks of March were the hardest sustained work either she or Ethan had done since the drainage trench. Dale injured his shoulder on the 11th of March trying to shift a post that was too heavy for one man and was limited to light work for the rest of the month, which meant the physical labor fell to Ethan and Eliza and 2 men. Ethan hired from town on day wages, brothers named Cass and Roy Fielder, both somewhere in their 20s, who were strong and willing and required significant supervision on the finer points of bed preparation, which Eliza provided with the steady patience of someone who has explained things before to people who needed it, explained and does not consider this beneath her. By the 3rd week of March, the first 14 beds were in. The kitchen garden was not beautiful. Eliza had never been aiming for beautiful. She had been aiming for productive and sustainable and correctly staged for the growing season. And what she had built was exactly that. 14 beds of carefully amended soil in the best section of the east quarter, staged in 3 planting groups to extend the harvest window, with a simple irrigation plan drawn from the redirected drainage channel that Ethan and Dale spent 4 days converting into a usable, gravity-fed system. Lou Parrish came out the day after the last bed went in and walked the rows with Eliza for an hour and said, at the end of it, "You're going to have more than I can take." "I know," Eliza said. "I've been talking to Mrs. Alcott about a standing order for the boarding house, and the Milligan place has agreed to take early greens through June. I need another buyer for the summer squash and the pole beans." "The mine commissary," Lou said. "They source from 60 miles south. I know the man who runs it. You want me to make an introduction?" Eliza looked at him. "Yes. I'll do it this week." He looked back at the beds. "You know Harriet Drummond has been telling people you know what you're about." "I heard that." "Harriet's not easy to impress." "I know." Eliza picked up the stake she'd been carrying and tapped it against her palm. "How much of the other thing is she still telling people?" Lou was quiet for a moment. He understood what she meant. Less than before. It's not gone, but less. He paused. "Vivian Cross was at the Drummond house 2 weeks ago. I heard they had words about it." "About me?" "About whether what she was saying was fair." Another pause. "Harriet's got her own opinion now. She's not easy to move off it once she's got it." Eliza nodded. She looked at the beds. "The work is what it is," she said, the same thing she'd told Ethan in December. "If it's good, people will see it." "They're starting to," Lou said, and left. April brought the first real growth, and with it something Eliza hadn't entirely expected. The emotional impact of watching a thing she had planned entirely in her head become actual and visible and alive in the ground. She had grown things before. She had managed her uncle's kitchen garden for 3 seasons, and she knew intellectually what germination looked like and what it meant in terms of the schedule ahead. But she had never grown something on land she was responsible for, in a place she had decided to stay, with stakes that were real and personal in a way her uncle's farm had never quite been. The first green row of early lettuce coming up in bed 3 on a cold April morning hit her somewhere unexpected, and she stood in the east quarter with the dirt still on her hands from the morning's check and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. She was standing there when Ethan found her. He looked at the row, then at her. "It's up," he said. "It's up." Her voice came out slightly thicker than she intended. He didn't say anything about that. He crouched down and looked at the seedlings and said, "Spacing looks right." "Spacing is right." She cleared her throat. "The second variety should be up by the end of the week if the temperature holds." "It'll hold." He stood up. He looked at her once, briefly, directly, in the way he sometimes did when he was not going to say the thing he was thinking but wanted her to know he'd noticed. Then he went back toward the barn. Eliza stood in the east quarter for another few minutes, and then she went back to work. What Vivian Cross did in April was more deliberate than what she'd done before. The winter's quiet campaign of questionable had not produced the result she'd intended. She had watched Harriet Drummond shift sides, watched Lou Parrish become an ally of the Whitmore operation, watched the mine commissary contact, a man named Gerald Poole, who was also a deacon's brother and well-regarded in town, make 2 visits to the East Quarter and come away with a supply agreement that people in Raven Hollow discussed as good business for the region. Vivian was not, at her core, a vindictive person. She would not have described herself that way, and in many ordinary matters she wasn't. But she had a specific, deep discomfort with situations that developed outside the parameters she understood, and what was developing on the Whitmore ranch had moved well outside anything she could easily categorize or dismiss. She went to her father. She told him plainly this time that she thought the Whitmore operation was becoming something the Cross Holdings should have a position on. She didn't frame it as personal, she framed it as business, which was the frame her father responded to. Harlan Cross listened, asked 2 questions, and said he would think about it. What he thought, after a few days, was that his daughter was right about the operation and wrong about the reason, and that the most useful thing he could do was what he had always done: move first, quietly, in a direction that gave his family options regardless of how things developed. He put in a word, through a business contact, with the man who controlled the land lease on the 40 acres directly south of the Whitmore East Quarter. That land had been fallow for 3 years. It was not currently for sale or for lease. It was, after Harlan Cross's word reached the right person, no longer available to anyone who might approach it from the Whitmore direction. Ethan found out about this in early May, from Frank Milligan, who had heard it from the leaseholder's foreman while buying seed. He came back to the ranch and sat in the kitchen for a while before he told Eliza. When he told her, she listened without interrupting. "The South 40, she said when he finished. Yes. That was the expansion land. She had drawn it into her long-range plan 3 months ago. The South 40, added to the East Quarter production, would have doubled the market capacity within 2 growing seasons. How certain are you? Milligan was certain. He had it from someone who would know. Eliza was quiet. This is Cross, she said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly. She looked at the table, at the notebook that was open to the expansion plan. She had been refining it just that morning. All right, she said. Not with defeat. With the specific tone she used when she was resetting, when a calculation had changed and she needed to work with the new numbers. I'm sorry, Ethan said. Don't be sorry. Tell me what other land is adjacent or accessible. He looked at her. Then he pulled his chair closer to the table and they bent over the map together and worked through it and found 2 other possible directions for expansion that were less ideal and more complicated and still, under careful examination, viable. They worked until late. Dale knocked once, got no answer, and sensibly went to bed. What happened in May was not what either of them was expecting. It happened on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the first real harvest from the early beds, lettuce and spring onions, and the first radishes, delivered in clean wooden crates that Eliza had built herself to Mrs. Alcott's boarding house in the Milligan place, and for the first time a small order to the mine commissary. The mine was 3 miles north of Raven Hollow, a silver and copper operation that employed 64 men and had been the economic backbone of the region for 11 years. Most of those men had families in town. The commissary fed the unmarried workers and supplied the family households at a small discount as a company benefit. Gerald Poole, who managed the commissary, had been pleased with the first delivery. He had sent word through Lou that he wanted to discuss expanding the standing order for summer. On that Thursday morning, at approximately 7:45, there was an accident. Eliza heard the sound first, a low, heavy concussion that she felt in her chest before she understood what it was, followed by a distant shout, and then the particular quality of silence that follows a bad thing. She was in the East Quarter. She straightened and looked north. Ethan came out of the barn at a run. The mine, he said. He had the horse saddled in 4 minutes. He looked at Eliza once, briefly. Stay here, he said. I'm coming. Eliza, I'm coming. She was already moving toward the second horse. They rode north together. The collapse had happened in the number 3 shaft, which ran under the ridge at an angle that the company engineers had flagged the previous autumn as requiring reinforcement. The reinforcement had been scheduled for spring. It had not yet been done. By the time Ethan and Eliza reached the mine, there were already 20 men standing at the shaft entrance and 3 men down in the dark trying to reach the ones who were trapped. The mine foreman, a German-born man named Royce, was at the entrance with a lamp and a face the color of old ash. "How many?" Ethan said. 7 trapped. Maybe 8. We can't. The forward section came down and there's a secondary risk of the sidewall going. Royce's voice was controlled in the way of a man who is very afraid and refusing to show it. "We've sent for the company engineer, but he's 3 hours out from Colton." "What's blocking the forward section?" "Timber fall 6, maybe 8 feet of it." Ethan looked at the shaft entrance. Eliza saw him make a decision she recognized. Not a quick decision, not a reckless one. The kind of decision that had already been made somewhere below the level of deliberate thought and was only now surfacing as action. "I know this shaft," he said. "I worked it for 2 seasons before my father died. I know where the secondary bracing runs." "Whitmore," Royce started. "Do you have someone else who knows it?" Royce was quiet for 1 second. "No." Ethan took the lamp. Eliza watched him go into the ground. She stood at the shaft entrance and felt something rearrange itself inside her chest that she did not have time to examine because there were other things to do. She turned to the men standing around and started organizing what she could see needed organizing. Water, because trapped men would need water. A clear space for anyone who came out injured. Someone to ride fast to town for the doctor. She gave the last task to a young man who looked capable of haste and watched him go and then turned back to the shaft. The men around her did what she asked. She didn't register in the moment that they were doing it. She was listening to the shaft. I was down there for 4 hours. Eliza did not count the hours while they were happening. She counted them afterward, when she was sitting outside in the late afternoon and trying to make sense of the shape of the day. While they were happening, she was simply present at the shaft entrance, doing what was in front of her to do, talking to the men who needed talking to, and being quiet with the ones who needed quiet, and at one point physically blocking the foreman from sending a second team down a side shaft that she had heard, from something Ethan said before he went in, was likely compromised. "You can't know that," Royce said. He said the east side wall of the number 3 is where the secondary risk is. That shaft accesses the east side wall. He's not an engineer. He's worked this mine for 2 seasons, and he knew where to go without a map. She looked at him. "Wait." Royce waited. It was not a comfortable waiting, but he waited. 3 of the trapped men came out at the 2-hour mark, guided by the 2 men who'd gone in before Ethan. 2 of them were injured, one badly, a broken arm and a deep cut on his head from the timber fall. The doctor had arrived by then and took them immediately. The other 4 men and Ethan were still underground. Eliza stood at the entrance. She thought, against her will, about the specific quality of the silence in the shaft. Not empty silence, but occupied silence, the kind that has weight and presence. She thought about the letter in the tin box at the ranch, all the letters, and about how Margaret had written, "I thought about our ranch," and about how that sentence had meant something specific about what it was to invest yourself in something before you knew if it would hold. She did not let herself finish that thought. At the 4-hour mark, there was movement in the shaft. The first of the 4 remaining trapped men came out, then the second and third together, one supporting the other. Then the man who'd gone in with Ethan at the beginning, carrying a lamp. Then Ethan. He came out blinking against the late afternoon light with timber dust in his hair and a cut on his forearm that had bled through the cloth he'd wrapped around it, and the expression of a man who has been in the dark for a long time and is still adjusting to the fact of the sky. He stopped at the entrance and looked around and found her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The cut needs to be looked at," she said. "I know. The doctor is still here." "All right." He walked toward her and stopped a few feet away, and they stood like that for a second in the particular sunlight of a May afternoon that had been much longer than it looked from where they were standing now. "Everyone's out," he said. "I know, I counted." She looked at the cut on his arm. "Come on." She walked him to where the doctor was and stood nearby while the doctor cleaned and wrapped the arm and said things about wound care that Ethan listened to with the partial attention of a very tired man, and she said nothing through any of it, And when it was done, she brought him water and he drank it, and they sat on the ground outside the mine entrance because neither of them had suggested anything else. The east side wall held, he said. I told Rouse it would. He looked at her sideways. You told Rouse. He wanted to send another team down the side shaft. I said no. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He listened to you. Eventually, she looked at her hands. They had dirt on them that she didn't remember acquiring. You knew where to go because you'd worked the mine. You said that before you went in. I did. You didn't say you were certain. I wasn't certain. He looked at the sky. I was confident. You taught me that distinction. She looked at him. He was still watching the sky with the exhausted and unguarded expression of someone who has just come through something and hasn't put his ordinary face back on yet. There was dirt in his hair and the bandage white on his forearm and the late light doing what it always did in this part of the country, making everything look more consequential than it normally seemed. She was not able, at that moment, to pretend that what she felt was something she had not been feeling for a while. She looked away. We should get back, she said. In a minute. Ethan. In a minute, he said again quietly. Not refusing, just asking for a minute. She sat beside him on the ground outside the mine, and they were quiet together while the other men moved around them, and the doctor packed his bag, and somewhere behind them a horse shifted and blew, and the minutes stretched into something longer that neither of them named. Raven Hollow talked about the rescue for weeks. 7 men out of a collapsed shaft, all of them alive, the last 4 guided through a timber fall in near darkness by a man who had not worked the mine in over a decade, but had remembered where the secondary bracing ran. The story acquired details in the telling, the way stories always do, some of which were true, and some of which were the embellishments that a community attaches to an event when it needs the event to mean something. What it meant to Raven Hollow was complex and not entirely clean. Ethan Whitmore had been, before May, a man the town respected at a middle distance. Capable, solitary, not the kind of person around whom the town's story organized itself. The rescue changed that. Not overnight and not uniformly, but in the way that a single action can shift the angle from which a person is seen, so that the same qualities that had seemed like reserve or stubbornness began to look, from the new angle, like something steadier. People who had not been to the Whitmore ranch found reasons to go. People who had been circulating Vivian Cross's framing of Eliza found that framing harder to hold when the woman in question had been the one standing at the shaft entrance for 4 hours organizing the response, blocking the foreman from a decision that might have sent more men into danger, and calmly directing water and medical access with the same competence she apparently applied to soil amendments and account books. Harriet Drummond said, to several people she trusted, that the Hale woman had a head on her shoulders and a backbone to go with it, and that anyone still concerned about the circumstances of her arrival should perhaps direct that concern somewhere more deserving. Vivian Cross heard this. She was not yet done, but she felt the ground shift under her position the way Eliza had felt the ground shift in the east quarter before the drainage trench was in. A subtle settling, a small loss of support. What Eliza noticed in the weeks after the mine was that something had changed between her and Ethan that neither of them had addressed. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announced itself. It was the kind that lived in small adjustments, in how long he held her gaze before looking away, in the specific quality of the silence between them, in the evenings that had always been companionable, but was now something slightly different without either of them having changed anything deliberately. She was aware of it. She was also aware of the reason she hadn't addressed it, which was the same reason she had looked away at the mine entrance when she felt what she felt, which was that Eliza Hale had a specific and well-maintained wariness about the cost of wanting things that weren't clearly hers to want. She had come here as a replacement for someone else. She had stayed because of the work. Those were the clear categories, and she had lived inside them carefully, and the categories had protected her from a kind of hope that could go wrong in ways she didn't want to examine. She was examining them now, against her preference. She was doing this one evening in late May when Vivian Cross rode up to the ranch house. Eliza was on the porch sorting seed packets for the summer succession planting. She heard the horse and looked up and saw Vivian dismounting at the gate with the particular posture of someone who has decided to do something and is committed to doing it before she changes her mind. Eliza set down the seed packets. Vivian came through the gate and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked different than she had from horseback in the East Quarter 6 months ago, less positioned, less composed, with something around her eyes that Eliza read as the look of someone who has not been sleeping well. "Ethan's not here," Eliza said. "I know. I saw him ride toward the north line, but—" Vivian paused. "I came to talk to you." Eliza looked at her. "All right," she said. Vivian came up one step, but not two. "I've been saying things about you in this town," she said. "Not lies exactly, but things I framed in a way that was meant to do damage. I think you know that." "I know it. I'm not going to pretend I did it for reasons that were entirely about you." Vivian's voice was controlled. "It cost something to keep it that way. That wouldn't be honest." "Then don't pretend." Vivian looked at her directly. It was the first time they had been face to face at the same level, and what Eliza saw was someone considerably more complicated than the woman on horseback, who had called her the sister in a tone designed to reduce. "I'm not apologizing," Vivian said. "That's not what this is. I don't know if what I did merits an apology or just a correction." She paused. "But I told Harriet Drummond last week that I'd been wrong about some things. I said it plainly. I thought you should know I said it." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. Vivian blinked. "Because it was true." "No," Eliza said. "Why did you tell me?" Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of honest discomfort. "Because I think you're staying," she said. "And if you're staying, then this town is not big enough for a long grudge, and I'd rather have it said plainly than have it sit between us for years." Eliza studied her. "You're not wrong about that," she said finally. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The mine commissary deal," Vivian said then, slightly carefully. "Gerald Poole told my father it's a good arrangement. He didn't know who he was telling." "And what did your father say?" Vivian's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "He said Whitmore's East Quarter was apparently not what he'd thought it was." Eliza picked up the seed packets again. "The South 40 would have helped," she said evenly. Vivian looked at the porch boards. "I know. I found other directions." "I know that too." Another pause, longer. "I'm not going to tell you my father will undo what he did. I don't have that kind of influence over him, and I wouldn't pretend I did." She met Eliza's eyes. "But I can stop making things harder than they need to be." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived as an adversary and was now standing one step below her on her own porch, offering something that was neither an apology nor a treaty, but something more honest than either. "All right," Eliza said, and meant it, or meant enough of it to start with. Vivian nodded once, turned, went back through the gate, and rode away without looking back. Eliza sat on the porch for a while after, with the seed packets in her hands and the late May evening settling around the ranch, and thought about the particular shape of things that don't resolve cleanly but shift into something workable, and about how that was, in her experience, how most real things went. She heard Ethan's horse coming back from the north line. She did not move from the porch. She waited and sorted seed packets, and let the evening come in around the edges of what she had not yet said to him, and was not yet certain she knew how to say. And somewhere in the East Quarter, the first summer growth was coming up through the amended ground, slow and sure and nothing like perfect, which was exactly what she had been aiming for all along. Ethan came back from the north line as the last light was going off the land, and he saw her on the porch from 50 yards out. The particular stillness of her, the way she sat with something in her hands but wasn't looking at it, and he knew before he dismounted that something had happened. He unsaddled the horse and led it to the water trough, and took his time with it because he had learned over 8 months of living in close proximity to Eliza Hale that she would say what needed saying when she was ready, and that pushing her toward it produced nothing useful. When he came up to the porch, she said without preamble, "Vivian Cross was here." He sat down on the step below her. Not because she'd invited it, but because it was where he'd sat before on evenings like this, and she hadn't asked him not to. What did she want? Eliza told him, plainly, in the same order it had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was also something he had learned, that Eliza's accounts of things were more useful when you let them run to their own end rather than redirecting them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You believe her," he said. Eliza thought about it honestly. I believe she said it. Whether she'll hold to it depends on things I can't predict. She set the seed packets down on the porch board beside her. She's not simple. I've been treating her as simple because it was easier. She's not, Ethan agreed. The South 40, I know. She said she couldn't undo it. She probably can't. Harlan Cross doesn't get moved by his daughter's conscience. He looked at the yard, at the darkening east quarter beyond it. But if she's done adding to it, that's something. Eliza nodded slowly. Then she said, "You were gone a long time today." "Fence work." "I know it was fence work. You were still gone a long time." He looked at her. She was looking at the east quarter, not at him, but there was something in the way she'd said it. Not accusatory, not worried exactly. Something else. "Is there something you want to say?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Not tonight," she said. He held that for a second, then nodded and stood up and went inside. And she stayed on the porch a while longer in the dark, and whatever it was she wasn't saying stayed with her through the evening and into a night where neither of them slept particularly well, though neither knew it about the other. June came in with heat, and the East Quarter came into full production, and it was, by any honest measure, more than Eliza had projected in her most optimistic February calculations. Not dramatically more. Not in the way of stories where a thing turns out perfectly beyond all expectation. More in the way of a plan that had been careful and well-reasoned, coming together in the manner of careful, well-reasoned plans. Mostly as expected, with some losses and some surprises, the losses and surprises roughly canceling each other out and leaving something solid. The pole beans came in 2 weeks early. The summer squash hit a disease problem in the 3rd week of June, a fungal issue that Eliza caught early and managed with a combination of soil sulfur and aggressive culling, losing roughly a third of that bed, but keeping the rest clean. The tomatoes were behind schedule and then surged, producing more than the first 3 buyer agreements could absorb, which led in the first week of July to an emergency conversation with Gerald Poole at the mine commissary that ended with an expanded standing order and an agreement about the following season's volume that Poole wanted documented in writing. Eliza drafted the agreement herself. She brought it to Ethan the same evening. He read it. He asked 2 questions about the pricing structure. She answered them. He suggested one adjustment to the delivery schedule. She agreed it was better, and they revised it together at the kitchen table. The next morning, she took it to Poole, and he signed it, and she brought the signed copy back and put it in the tin box. Not the one with Margaret's letters, a different one, a new one she had bought in March for operational documents. She noticed, putting it in the box, that the box was getting full. She noticed this and then set it aside and went back to the East Quarter because the tomatoes were not going to stake themselves. It was Dale who finally said something. He said it on a Tuesday morning in mid-July when Ethan was replacing a section of irrigation piping and Dale was handing him fittings, and they had been working together in silence for 20 minutes, which was their ordinary mode, until Dale said, without particular preamble, "You going to say something to her or not?" Ethan tightened the fitting he was holding. "Mind your business, Dale." "I'm old enough to mind your business if I want." Dale handed him the next fitting. "It's getting uncomfortable to be around." "Nothing is uncomfortable." "From where I stand, something is." Dale was quiet for a moment. "She's been here 8 months. She's fixed your East Quarter and built your market, and she was at that mine shaft for 4 hours while you were underground, and she didn't fall apart. Not once, not even close. And you 2 sit at that kitchen table every night and talk about irrigation piping." He paused. "That's what I mean by uncomfortable." Ethan said nothing. "I'm not saying it's simple," Dale said. "I know about the sister. I know how she came here. I'm saying that the how of a thing isn't always the most important part of it." "I know that." "Then why are you fixing irrigation pipe on a Tuesday morning instead of saying what needs saying?" Ethan put down the pipe wrench. He sat back on his heels in the dirt and looked at the irrigation channel running clean and correctly through the East Quarter, the thing that Eliza had redirected in November in 11 days of hard groundwork, and he thought about a lot of things at once, and none of them resolved into anything clean. "She hasn't said anything either," he said. "She's waiting for you." "You don't know that. I've been watching the 2 of you for 8 months, Dale said. "I know that." Ethan picked up the pipe wrench. "Hand me the next fitting," he said. Dale handed it over. He didn't say anything else about it because Dale was the kind of man who made a point once and let it stand, but the point stood there in the irrigation ditch between them for the rest of the morning. solid and inconvenient as the hardpan layer Eliza had hit 3 feet down in November said. What moved things was not a conversation. It was a document. In the third week of July, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Eliza from a law office in Colton Junction. She opened it at the kitchen table while Ethan was outside and read it twice. And by the time he came in for the midday meal, she had read it a third time and was sitting with it on the table in front of her and an expression he hadn't seen before. Not distress exactly, but a kind of careful reckoning. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. It was from a lawyer named Horace Fenn, and it concerned a property matter related to the Hale family estate in Pennsylvania. Specifically, a small amount of money that had been held in legal dispute since her father's death and had now been released to Eliza as the surviving heir. Not a large amount. The letter named a figure that was respectable but not transformative, enough to do something with, enough to constitute a decision. "Your father's estate," he said. "There was a dispute with a creditor. Margaret and I didn't think there was anything left. Apparently there was a small property that the creditor didn't have a proper claim on, and the court finally agreed." She looked at the letter. "It's enough for a train ticket and a start somewhere." He was very still. "Is that what you're thinking about?" he said. She looked at him directly. "I'm thinking about what my options are. That's different." "Is it?" The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the East Quarter was in full July production. She could see through the window the staked tomatoes and the pole bean rows, and the result of 8 months of work laid out in the afternoon sun, all of it real and solid and hers in the way that things are yours when you have built them from the ground up with your own hands, and your own calculations, and your own stubbornness. "I've been waiting," she said, "for you to say something." He set the letter down. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "That's a ridiculous situation." "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him. He looked back, and there it was. The thing that had been sitting in the kitchen with them for months, and every evening at the table and every morning in the East Quarter and every moment in between, finally taking up exactly the space it had always occupied but no longer being navigated around. "I don't know how to do this cleanly," Eliza said. "I came here as someone else. That's always going to be the beginning of it." "The beginning isn't the whole thing." "I know that. I'm saying it's complicated." "I know it's complicated." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking for it to be uncomplicated. I'm asking if you want to stay. Not for the ranch, not for the garden. For what it is between us. Whatever that is. Which is something. I think you know it's something." She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I know it's something." Neither of them moved for a second. Then Eliza picked up the lawyer's letter and folded it and set it aside. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was the plainest thing she had said to him since Margaret was my sister, and it landed the same way, with weight, with reality, with the specific gravity of a true thing said without performance. Ethan nodded. He got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat back down. And they did not say anything sentimental about it, because neither of them was built for sentiment of the stated kind, and because the coffee was real and the East Quarter was outside the window, and that was enough. The news about the mine came in August, and it came badly. Word reached Raven Hollow on a Wednesday morning through the mine foreman Rose, who rode into town with the expression of a man delivering something he would rather not deliver. The company that owned the mine, a holding operation based in Denver that had acquired it 4 years ago, had sent notice of an operational review. The review was a formality, Royce said, but what the formality was reviewing was whether continued operation of the Raven Hollow mine was economically viable in light of the May collapse, the cost of the required reinforcements, and what the Denver office described as a challenging mineral yield projection for the next 18 months. What it meant? Translated from corporate language into plain speech. The mine might close. 64 employed men, most of them with families in town. The commissary, the housing the company maintained for unmarried workers. The downstream spending that those 64 wages produced in Raven Hollow's small economy, all of it sitting on a decision being made in Denver by men who had visited the mine twice in 4 years and considered it a line item. The town meeting was called for the following Friday. Ethan heard about it from Lou Parrish on Thursday and came home and told Eliza, and they sat with it. "The commissary order," Eliza said. "I know." If the mine closes, that's a third of our summer revenue. I know that too. He looked at the table. But that's not the main problem. No, she said. The main problem is 64 families. He nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what does the company need to decide to stay? Evidence that the yield projection is wrong, or that the cost of reinforcement is manageable, or both. He paused. Reyes has some numbers, but he's not a businessman. He's a mine foreman. He knows the operation, but he doesn't know how to present it. Eliza was already reaching for her notebook. Tell me what you know about the yield figures, she said. What? The Friday meeting was held in the town hall, which was a generous name for a large room attached to the back of the hardware store that smelled of sawdust and kerosene and held, at capacity, about 90 people. It held more than that on this Friday. People were standing along the walls and out through the side door into the alley, and the noise of 90-plus people who are frightened and trying not to show it was a particular kind of noise that Eliza recognized from the mine shaft in May. The same suppressed quality, the same determined surface over real fear. Harlan Cross was there. He was near the front, which was where Harlan Cross positioned himself as a matter of practice. Vivian was beside him, and she looked at Eliza when Eliza came in with Ethan, and her expression was unreadable but not hostile, which Eliza noted and filed. Reyes spoke first. He laid out what he knew about the company's review in the plain, factual way of a man who respects facts and trusts other people to respect them too, and what he said was not reassuring. The yield projections were based on core samples from 2 years ago. The reinforcement estimates the company had received were from a contractor in Denver who had not inspected the site since the May collapse. The numbers Roos had were better than the numbers Denver had, but Roos did not have a way to present them that would reach the people in Denver who were making the decision. There was a long, uneven silence after Reyes finished. Then several people spoke at once, and then several more. And the meeting began doing what frightened town meetings do, moving in circles, generating heat without light. The same fear expressed in different voices arriving at the same unresolved place each time. Ethan stood up. The room got quieter. Not because Ethan Whitmore was the kind of man who commanded silence by standing. He wasn't, or hadn't been, not before May. But because the room remembered May, and what a man could do when he knew where the secondary bracing ran. The yield projection is wrong, he said. We have evidence it's wrong. And the reinforcement cost the company has been quoted is not what the actual cost would be, because the quote came from someone who hasn't been in the mine since before the collapse. He paused. What the company in Denver needs is a correct set of numbers and someone to present them. We can put that together. How? Someone said from the back. The yield question. Reyes can document with the core samples from this spring, which are better than the 2-year-old samples Denver is using. The reinforcement cost. We need an independent estimate from someone who's actually seen the current state of the shaft. He looked at Royce. Can you get someone out here within the week? I know a man in Colton, Royce said. He's independent. He'll give a fair estimate. Get him. Ethan looked back at the room. The presentation to the company, the business case. That's something we can build from what we have. It needs to be in their language. Numbers they recognize and a structure they take seriously. He sat down. The meeting did not resolve into anything clean that evening. Meetings like this rarely do. But it shifted from the circling fear into something with a direction, and that was different enough to matter. Afterward, outside in the August evening, Harlan Cross walked up to Ethan. I was alone. Vivian had stayed to talk to someone inside. And he stood with the particular posture of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a space, looking at Ethan with the assessing expression he had used on people and situations for 40 years. The business case you're talking about, Harlan said. That's not a simple thing to put together. No, Ethan said. You know how to do it. I know enough. He paused. Eliza knows more. Harlan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked past him to where Eliza was talking with Reyes and Lou Parrish on the other side of the door. She put together the commissary agreement, Harlan said. It wasn't a question. She put together everything operational on the ranch. The agreement was hers. Another pause. Harlan Cross was not a man who showed much, but something moved across his face. Not remorse, nothing that soft, more like a recalculation of the kind he made when market conditions shifted. The South 40 lease, he said. I know about it, Ethan said. I made a business decision. I know that too. Harlan looked at him. If the mine stays open, the commissary, the workers' families, the downstream business, that matters to my holdings too, not just yours. He was quiet for a moment. If she puts together a case that keeps this mine open, I'd consider that a fair accounting of certain things. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Tell that to her, he said. Not to me. Well, Harlan Cross did not tell it to Eliza that evening. He was not, at 62 years of age, a man who moved quickly toward uncomfortable, direct conversations. But what he did do was send Vivian to the ranch the following Monday with a set of the Cross Operations historical yield documentation from the years when Harlan had briefly held a supply contract with the mine, numbers that showed what genuine production looked like in this region's mineral profile and would directly contradict the pessimistic projections Denver was using. Vivian brought it herself. She came to the kitchen door and handed the folder to Eliza and said, "My father thought this might be useful." And Eliza took it and looked at the top page and said, "It is. Thank you." And that was the whole exchange. But it was real, and both of them knew it was real, and it was different from the porch conversation in May in a way that was harder to define but easier to feel, less about correction, more about beginning. The business case took 9 days. Eliza built the core of it. She worked from Reyes's spring yield documentation and the independent reinforcement estimate. The Colton engineer came out in 4 days, inspected the shaft, and produced a figure that was 30% lower than what Denver had quoted, which was significant. And from the Cross historical data and from numbers she had tracked herself through the commissary agreement about downstream economic impact on the region. She structured it the way she had structured the commissary agreement, clean, specific, with every claim supported by a number and every number sourced. Ethan read each section as she finished it, and asked the questions a skeptical person in Denver would ask, which was useful because Eliza was sometimes so close to the logic of a thing that she forgot other people needed more scaffolding. Dale stayed out of the kitchen for 9 days. He brought food to the door twice and left it there. On the 9th day, they had a document of 14 pages. Reyes looked at it and said it was the most organized thing he had seen in his 20 years in mining operations. Lou Parrish read the economic impact section and said he hadn't known it could be put that clearly. Frank Milligan, who had no role in the process but heard about it and came over, read the first 3 pages and said nothing but nodded in a sustained way that was more meaningful than words. Harlan Cross read it in its entirety and did not say anything to anyone about what he thought of it, but the following morning he made a telephone call from the Cross House to a business associate in Denver, and what he said in that call was that the Raven Hollow mine was a better investment than the current review suggested, and that a document was coming from the local operation that the relevant people should read before they made any decisions. Nobody told Eliza about the call. She found out later, from Vivian, in the plain way that Vivian had begun to communicate with her, directly and without excess. The company's response came 3 weeks after the document was delivered. It came as a letter to Reyes from the Denver office, and Reyes brought it to the town hall on a Thursday evening where 20 or 30 people had gathered not because anything had been formally organized, but because a small town with a shared fear tends to aggregate around the place where news arrives. The letter did not promise permanence. That would have been too much to expect from a company in Denver that had business considerations reaching well beyond Raven Hollow. What it said was that based on the supplemental documentation received, the company was suspending the closure review pending a site visit from a senior operations manager, and that the reinforcement work on the number 3 shaft would proceed on an expedited basis, with a revised cost arrangement that reflected the independent estimate. It was not a victory, exactly. Roos said that plainly. It was a postponement and an opening, not a resolution. The site visit would determine more. But 64 families had more time than they'd had 3 weeks ago, and the reinforcement would make the mine safer, and the document that had produced this result was sitting in a Denver office with Eliza Hale's logic running through every page of it. People in Raven Hollow knew who had built it. The particular current of opinion that Vivian Cross had seeded the previous winter had been running thin since May, and what happened in August reduced it further, not because people had forgotten where it started, but because they had newer, more substantial information to weigh against it. Harriet Drummond said nothing publicly. She didn't need to. She had been saying the right things for months. Maren Schultz told her husband that night that the Hale woman should have been here from the beginning, which was a complicated statement given the circumstances, but which Maren's husband understood and agreed with. On the last Saturday of August, Ethan asked Eliza to walk the East Quarter with him in the evening. She knew something was different from the way he asked. Not practically, not with a specific purpose stated, just walk with me in a tone that was quieter than his usual register. They walked the perimeter of the East Quarter in the late August light, which was the particular gold of a summer going toward autumn, the same quality it had been on the October afternoon she'd arrived. She noticed that, and he probably did too, and neither of them mentioned it. When they reached the far corner, the corner she'd staked first, back in March, where the topsoil was deepest and the drainage truest, he stopped. He looked at the garden, at the staked tomatoes and the late summer squash, and the orderly rows of what had been empty, compacted, alkaline ground 11 months ago. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking about how to ask it, and I haven't found a way that doesn't sound like more than it is or less than it is, so I'm just going to say it plainly." "That's the only way worth saying things," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to stay. Not as a partner in the operation, not as the arrangement we've had. I want—" He stopped. Tried again. "I want this to be yours. All of it. The ranch, the East Quarter, this—" He gestured at the ground under their feet. "Whatever we build next, I want you to have standing in it that doesn't depend on whether I'm here or not. Legal standing, real standing." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to marry me. Not because of Margaret, not because of what brought you here, because of the last 11 months and because I would be less without you, and I know that clearly." The East Quarter was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the lower field a nightbird was starting. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a train platform in October and a man saying, "You're not her," and the particular weight of that. She thought about 11 days of drainage trench work and 9 days of building a case for 64 families and the 4 hours she'd stood at a mine shaft and counted. She thought about Margaret, who had written, "I thought about our ranch," and about how that sentence no longer hurt the way it had. Not because she'd forgotten it, but because she had come to understand that what Margaret had imagined and what was real were not in competition. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. And they stood in the East Quarter in the August evening with the garden around them and the light going slowly off the land. It was not a perfect moment. Her boots were dirty, and his arm still had the faint scar from the mine, and somewhere behind them Dale was almost certainly watching from the fence line with the expression of a man who has been right about something and intends to let it speak for itself. But it was real, every part of it, and real was what she had always been aiming for. Dale had been right about watching from the fence line. He admitted it the following morning without apology, in the way he handled most things, directly and without embellishment. "I figured," he said when Ethan told him at breakfast. "You figured." "Been figuring since March." He poured his coffee and sat down. "Congratulations." Liza came in from the East Quarter with dirt on her hands, and he said the same thing to her, and she said, "Thank you," and washed her hands at the basin and sat down. And that was the extent of the ceremony in the Whitmore kitchen on the morning after an August evening that had changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Nothing about the work, nothing about the daily shape of the life they'd already been building, and everything about what that life was called and who had standing in it. They were married in the 3rd week of September, which gave the East Quarter time to finish its summer production run and gave Eliza time to prepare the fall planting schedule and gave neither of them time to make the occasion more elaborate than it needed to be. The marriage took place in the town hall, the same room that smelled of sawdust and kerosene, cleared of its meeting chairs for the afternoon, with the justice of the peace and perhaps 40 people who had found out and come without being formally invited, which was how things happened in Raven Hollow, when they happened at all. Harriet Drummond came. Lou Parrish and his wife came. Frank Milligan came and stood in the back and left quietly afterward without speaking to anyone, which was how Frank Milligan attended most social events. Reyes came and brought 2 of the mine workers whose families Eliza had met during the weeks of the Denver correspondence, and those men stood near the door with their hats in their hands and the expression of people who are present at something they consider significant. Maren Schultz cried a little, which surprised everyone, including Maren. Vivian Cross did not come. She sent a note the day before, a brief, correct note, written in a clean hand, saying she wished them well. Eliza read it twice and put it in the tin box with the operational documents, which was, she thought, the right place for it. Not the letter tin with Margaret's correspondence, but the place where things that were real and ongoing lived. The ceremony was short. Ethan said what needed saying in plain language, and Eliza said the same. The justice of the peace pronounced them married with the efficient warmth of a man who has done this many times and still means it each time, and that was that. Afterward, standing outside the town hall in the September afternoon, Ethan said, "Mrs. Whitmore." Eliza looked at him. "I'm keeping Hale," she said, "professionally, for the business agreements." "I know," he said. "I was just saying it." "Say it again in 10 years, she said. "See if it still sounds strange." It didn't sound strange to him at all, but he kept that to himself because she would have found it sentimental, and she would have been right. The Denver site visit happened in October, almost exactly 1 year after Eliza had stepped off the train onto the platform in Raven Hollow with her dead sister's letter in her hand. The company sent a man named Aldrich, who was younger than anyone in Raven Hollow had expected and more thorough. He spent 3 days at the mine, went through every shaft with Reus, reviewed the reinforcement work that had been completed on the number 3, and asked specific questions about the yield projections that Reus answered from the documentation Eliza had organized in August. On the 3rd day, Aldrich asked to meet the people who had put together the business case. Reus brought him to the Whitmore ranch. Eliza met him in the kitchen. Ethan was there, and Reus and Aldrich sat across the table from all three of them with a copy of the 14-page document and asked questions for 2 hours. His questions were good, not hostile but precise, the questions of someone who has read the document carefully and wants to understand where the assumptions come from. Eliza answered them the same way she answered every question that mattered, without excess, without defensiveness, with the specific evidence behind each claim accessible and clear. At the end of 2 hours, Aldrich closed the document. The yield projection in the review was based on a model that doesn't account for the lateral seam variations in this region, he said. Your documentation identified that. We should have caught it ourselves. He paused. The reinforcement cost estimate was also wrong, which you also identified. That's 2 significant errors on our side that almost produced a very poor decision. The document was intended to correct them, Eliza said. It did. He looked at her. The company is committed to continued operation. The reinforcement work will be completed through the spring. We're also looking at updating the yield model for the full property. That's a longer project, and we'd want local input. He paused again. Would you be willing to consult on that? Paid engagement, formal arrangement. Eliza looked at Ethan briefly. He was looking at the table, which was his way of not influencing her answer. Send me the terms, she said. I'll look at them. After Aldrich left, Royce shook her hand and then Ethan's and walked out to his horse with the measured pace of a man carrying something lighter than he'd arrived with. Ethan looked at the table. Consultant, he said. Don't make it larger than it is. I'm not making it anything. I'm noting it. She picked up the copy of the document Aldrich had left behind and straightened its pages against the table. It's work that needs doing. If they're serious about the yield model, someone who knows this land should be part of it. She set the document down. That's all it is. He looked at her. You know it's more than that. She didn't answer immediately. Outside, the October afternoon light was doing what October light did here, cutting sideways through the scrub and landing on things at the angle that made them look considered rather than accidental. Maybe, she said, but I'm not going to say so out loud and invite the jinx. He smiled at that. A real smile, not a polite one. She saw it and looked away before he could see what it did to her face. The fall planting went in on schedule. The Second Amendment cycle in the East Quarter showed the improvement Eliza had projected. The soil pH in the problem areas had moved meaningfully toward neutral, and the compaction in the sections closest to the redirected drainage had begun to break down in the way amended ground does when the water is moving correctly. It would not be finished by the second season. She had always known that. The third season was when the full picture would emerge, and she was here for the third season, which was a thing she had not been certain of when she designed the plan. Frank Milligan applied the same amendment program to his North Field in September, using the schedule Eliza had worked out the previous winter in that 40-minute feed store conversation with Marin. He sent a note in October saying the initial results were better than he'd expected, and asking a follow-up question about the timing of the second limestone application. Eliza wrote back with the answer and two additional observations he hadn't asked for but would need before spring. He sent another note. She wrote back. By November, they had an informal correspondence about soil chemistry that was purely practical and entirely serious, and which Eliza found, in the evenings when she sat down to write those letters, unexpectedly satisfying in a way she hadn't anticipated. The satisfaction of knowledge being used by someone who would use it correctly and pass it on. She mentioned this to Ethan one evening. "You should write it down," he said. "I am writing it down. That's the letters. I mean all of it. The amendment program, the drainage work, the staging schedule, the whole system." He looked at her. "Other people in this county have the same problems we had. If you wrote it as a practical guide, not a letter, a real document, Maren could sell it at the feed store." Eliza looked at him. "That's a strange idea," she said. "It's a practical idea." She thought about it for 2 days. Then she started writing. It took most of November and part of December because she was doing everything else at the same time and because she wrote the way she did everything, carefully, with revision, with the specific attention of someone who cannot put their name to something imprecise. The document was 31 pages when she finished it. She had Ethan read it because he would find the parts that needed more scaffolding, and he found 4 of them, and she revised them, and then she gave it to Maren Schultz. Maren read it over 2 evenings and came to the ranch on the 3rd morning and said, "How many copies can you make?" 3 ranchers in the county bought copies in December, 2 more in January. By March, when the spring planting season was beginning and people were thinking again about soil and water and yield, the feed store had sold 17 copies and Maren was asking about a second printing. It was not a large thing by any measure that the wider world used, but in Raven Hollow and the surrounding county, it was the kind of thing that changes how a place understands what it can do, and those things tend to travel further than they appear to at first. The first full harvest of the second season came in the following summer, and it was what Eliza had projected in her most careful calculations, and better in the specific places she had hoped it might be better and worse, in the 2 areas where she had known the risk was real. The summer squash beds that had taken the fungal hit the previous year came in clean and full. The tomato yield exceeded the commissary standing order by enough that she renegotiated the agreement upward, which Poole agreed to without significant resistance because the quality had been consistent and reliability in a supplier was worth paying for. The pole beans, the variety she'd taken the most care sourcing, were the best thing in the ground that year. They came in over 3 weeks in a long, even harvest that was exactly what she'd designed the staging for, and she stood at the end of a row one July morning pulling beans into a crate and thought about a notebook diagram on a kitchen table in November, and a man asking if she could do it in a week, and herself saying she knew how. She had known how. That had been true. But knowing how and doing it are separated by everything in between. The hardpan layer, the disease problem, the Denver correspondence, the 40 minutes with Maren in the feed store, the 4 hours at the mine shaft, the 9 days at the kitchen table, the August evening in the East Quarter when she had said yes to a question that was also a beginning, and what she had learned about that distance, in the 2 years since she stepped off a train into someone else's life, was that you could not calculate it in advance. You could only work it, day by day, from the side of it you were standing on. She picked up the crate and carried it to the wagon. In August of the 2nd year, a letter arrived from Pennsylvania. It was from a woman named Clara Holt, who had known both sisters in their childhood in the years before the family's difficulties began, and who had heard, through the slow channels by which information travels across distances, that Eliza had married and was running a ranch operation in the frontier and had apparently done something significant involving a mine and a very large garden. Clara's letter was warm and slightly incredulous and full of the particular affection of someone who knew you before you were who you became. "I always thought Margaret was the one who would end up somewhere remarkable," she wrote. "She was the one who talked about it. But you were always the one who could do anything she set her mind to, and I think maybe you needed somewhere worth setting your mind to. I hope it is that." Eliza read the letter twice and then sat with it for a while. She thought about Margaret, which she still did, not with the acute pain of the first months, but with something steadier, a presence that had softened into the background of her life, the way the sound of the wind in the scrub had become part of the sound of home, there, when you listened for it, not demanding when you didn't. She had visited the grave. Not in Pennsylvania, She couldn't afford the journey in the first year and wouldn't leave the ranch in the second at a critical point in the season. But she had written to the church in the town where Margaret was buried and asked them to plant something on the grave if it was possible, and they had written back to say they had planted a rose bush, yellow, which was the color Margaret had mentioned in one of her letters as her preference. She had not told Ethan about that. She told him now, sitting at the kitchen table in August with Clara's letter beside her. He listened. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You should write back to Clara," he said. "I'm going to. Invite her to visit." Eliza looked at him. "We have room," he said. "The East Quarter's not going anywhere, and you should have someone here who knew you before." She looked at the letter, at Clara's handwriting, which was round and slightly uneven in the way of people who didn't write often enough to have developed a formal hand. "She'd find it very strange here," Eliza said. "Probably." He picked up his coffee. "Most people find it strange here. They get used to it." She smiled at that, a real one, the kind that got to her eyes. He saw it, and looked back at his coffee with the particular expression of a man who has learned not to make too much of things that mean a great deal to him, because she would know he was making much of it, and he preferred to let her decide what to do with that. She wrote to Clara the following week. The mine yield model consultation began in September and ran through the winter, and it was more substantial than Eliza had expected when she agreed to the terms. Aldrich had been serious about local input. He sent a junior engineer named Price, who was 23 and knew the technical side thoroughly, and the local landscape not at all. And Eliza spent a significant number of mornings in the first 2 months explaining things about this particular ground and this particular water system that no amount of technical training replaced. Price was not always easy. He had the specific confidence of a young man who knows he is competent and has not yet fully learned that competence in one domain does not transfer automatically to others. He pushed back on several of Eliza's assessments in the early weeks with arguments that were technically coherent and geographically wrong, and she corrected him, patiently and precisely, 3 or 4 times before he began to understand that she was not deferring to his training because his training did not include the 2 years she had spent reading this land at ground level. By November, they had a reasonable working relationship. By December, when the preliminary yield model revisions were complete and Price took them back to Denver, he said to Aldrich in his report that the local consultant had been the most valuable part of the process, which Aldrich relayed to Eliza in a note that she also put in the document 10. The model revisions showed a yield potential 38% higher than the original review projection. The mine would not be closing. The 64 families had more than a postponement now. They had a company that had recalculated and found, to its own profit, that Raven Hollow was worth investing in. Roos heard the final numbers in January and rode out to the ranch in the cold to tell Ethan and Eliza in person because he was that kind of man. 38%, he said, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on because he hadn't planned to stay, had only planned to deliver this news directly. "Sit down, Roos," Eliza said. "Have coffee." He sat down. He had coffee. He stayed for an hour and talked about the spring reinforcement schedule and the new equipment the company was sending and a raise the workers would be receiving that he had personally negotiated in conjunction with the yield announcement, which was not a small thing and which he was clearly proud of, and appropriately so. When he left, Ethan stood at the window and watched his horse go back toward the road. 38%, he said. The original model was badly designed, Eliza said. She was already at the table with the fall yield records, working on the comparison she'd been building since the second season's numbers were finalized. It wasn't a difficult correction once you had the right data. That's not what I'm saying. She looked up. I know, she said, after a moment. He turned from the window. 64 families. And the families of the people who supply the commissary, and the people those wages support in town, and the feed store, and the hardware store, and Mrs. Alcott's boarding house, and... She stopped. Looked down at the records. I know. That document was yours. The document was ours. You found the gaps. Eliza. She looked at him. Take the credit, he said. Not unkindly, with the specific directness he used for things he considered important. You don't have to minimize it. It's yours. Take it. She held his gaze for a moment. She was not by nature someone who took credit easily. She had grown up in circumstances that taught her to keep her head down, to be useful without being visible, to let the work speak without drawing attention to the hand behind it. It was a survival strategy that had served her and also cost her things she could not fully calculate. She was trying to learn a different one. "All right," she said. "Was that so hard?" "Yes," she said honestly, and went back to the yield records. And he sat down across from her, and they worked through the evening together, the way they had worked through hundreds of evenings, with the lamp between them and the wind outside and the east quarter dark and ready for spring. Clara Holt arrived in April. She was a small, energetic woman of about 40 who descended from the train at Raven Hollow Station with a large bag and an expression of genuine curiosity and hugged Eliza on the platform with the unself-conscious warmth of someone who has known you since childhood and does not stand on ceremony about it. Eliza hugged her back and felt something she hadn't been expecting. The specific feeling of being known, not by the person she had become in Raven Hollow, but by the whole arc of herself. The person who had grown up in a pharmacy in Pennsylvania and managed her father's illness and worked her uncle's farm and written 3 letters to a stranger out of grief and stubbornness, and ended up here, 2 years later, with her name on a business agreement and a marriage and a 31-page guide to soil amendment and 38% of the reason a mine was still open. "You look different," Clara said, stepping back and looking at her. "You look like you live somewhere." Eliza thought about that. "I do," she said. Clara stayed 3 weeks. She was not suited to ranch work and did not pretend to be, but she was genuinely interested in everything and asked real questions and had the useful quality of seeing Eliza from the outside in a way that people who lived inside a situation could not. She said, near the end of her visit, sitting on the porch on an April evening while Ethan was in the barn and Dale had gone to town for the evening, "You know what I think about how you got here?" "How I got here," Eliza said. "The way of it. Margaret and the letters and the train." Clara looked at the east quarter, which was in its spring state. The beds prepped, the cold frames starting, the suggestion of what would be there in 2 months visible to anyone who knew how to read it. "I used to think it was the saddest story when I first heard it." "It is sad," Eliza said. "The part about Margaret is sad." "Yes, but the rest of it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You came here to deliver a letter, and you ended up delivering about 10,000 other things besides." Eliza looked at the east quarter. She thought about what Clara had said and what she thought about it. She had learned in the 2 years since October to be careful about the stories she told herself about her own life. Not to make them too neat, not to let the current shape of things retroactively smooth over the parts that had been genuinely hard and uncertain. The drainage trench had been hard. The 9 days building the Denver document had been harder. The 4 hours at the mine shaft had been the hardest thing she had ever done, not because of the physical waiting, but because of what she had felt while she was doing it, and what that feeling told her about where she had arrived, emotionally, in a place she had intended to be passing through. She had not planned any of it. She had planned the drainage trench and the kitchen garden and the amendment schedule. The rest of it, Ethan, the town, the mine, the 31 pages, the consulsion, the thing she was now, which was something she didn't have a single clean word for, none of that had been in her notebook. Life, in her experience, did not sit still long enough to be planned entirely. You made the calculations you could make, and you worked the ground in front of you, and you paid attention to what the ground was telling you, and sometimes the thing that grew was what you'd planted, and sometimes it was something else entirely. And the question was whether you had the sense to tend it either way. "I came to deliver a letter," Eliza said. "That part is true." And it turned out there was other work to do. She looked at the east quarter. "There's always other work to do. You just have to decide if you're the one to do it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret would have liked this version," she said quietly, "of how it went." Eliza was still for a moment. "I think so too," she said. They sat on the porch until the light was gone, talking about things that didn't require resolution. The kind of conversation that happens when 2 people have known each other long enough that the silences between the words are as comfortable as the words themselves. In the spring of the 3rd season, the East Quarter showed what Eliza had been waiting for. It showed it not dramatically, not in a single morning where everything was suddenly transformed, but over 3 weeks of slow April warmth when the soil in the problem areas, the sections that had been alkaline and compacted and stubborn for as long as the Whitmore land had been worked, came up different. Not perfect. not resolved into something that required no further attention, but genuinely, measurably different in the way you could push a probe into the ground and feel the resistance change, in the way the surface no longer crusted the same way after rain, in the way the seed germinated in bed 6, the worst of the original problem areas, at the same rate as the beds that had always been good. Eliza was in the east quarter the morning she confirmed it. She was alone. Ethan was on the north line and Dale was mending tack, and the morning was cool and still the way April mornings were before the heat found its way back into the day. She crouched at bed 6 and pushed her fingers into the soil and felt what it felt like now versus what it had felt like 2.5 years ago, and the difference was not enormous, but it was real, and it was her work, and it was going to compound forward from here. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and looked at the east quarter. She thought about all of it, which she rarely let herself do because she was by nature more interested in what came next than in what had already happened. She thought about the letter she had carried on the train and the platform in October, and the man who had said "you're not her" in a voice that was flat and certain and breaking all at once. She thought about 11 days of hardpan and a tin box of operational documents, and a mine shaft in May, and 9 days at a kitchen table, and a woman on a porch step who had come to correct something rather than apologize for it, which was its own kind of courage. She thought about 31 pages on soil amendment, and 64 families, and a yield model, and a train arriving in April with Clara in it, looking at her and saying, "You look like you live somewhere." She did live somewhere. That was the thing she had not known, standing on that platform with the letter in her hand, that she had needed more than anything and had not known she needed, not just work to do or a place to stay or a person to work beside, but somewhere that was actually hers, that she had built and tended and fought for and earned, that would exist and continue regardless of the circumstances that had brought her to the door of it. She had not planned to find that here. She had not planned most of what had happened here, but she had worked it, every part of it, with the same attention she gave to soil and drainage and seed timing, and the thing that had grown from that work was her life, the actual one, the one that fit. That was not a small thing. She thought, as she sometimes did, about what she would tell the woman who had stood on that platform in October not knowing what any of this would be, afraid and controlled and carrying someone else's name into someone else's life, with no clear destination on the other side of delivering the letter. She would not tell her it would be easy. It hadn't been. She would not tell her the hard parts were worth it, because that framing suggested the hard parts were merely the price of admission, which was not quite right either. The hard parts were not beside the point, but inside it, woven through everything that had become true. What she would tell her was simpler than that and harder to accept in advance of the evidence. She would tell her, work the ground in front of you, pay attention to what it needs. Don't leave before you find out what it can become. She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands. The east quarter was coming up in all 14 beds, clean and even in the April morning. The third season of a thing she had built from compacted, failing ground with a diagram on a kitchen table and a level of stubbornness that had, in the end, served her better than any plan. She picked up her crate and went to start the morning harvest, and behind her the east quarter grew in the quiet way that things grow when the ground is finally right. Without drama, without announcement, steady and real and more than she had calculated and exactly what she had been aiming for.